Within each of us is a sense of honor, pride, passion, valor, energy, discipline, glory, youthful vigor, righteousness, motivation, bravery, and of enthusiasm. Coincidingly, we each have a desire to be recognized, to be seen, and to belong. This desire is not rational, although it is persistent and is responsible for some of history's greatest and most horrific moments. To the ancient Greeks, this impulse was known as Thymos, sometimes said as Thumos. To them, it was known to be the spirited part of the soul, closely linked to the vitality of human breath and blood. Plato understood the psyche to be divided into three distinct parts, the first of which is logos, reason, another of which is epithumia, appetite or desire. Epithumia is what drives us towards our most animalistic desires, like food, sex, and comfort. The final part of the psyche, according to Plato, was Thumos, spiritedness. According to Plato, logos resides in the head, epithumia in the stomach, and thymos in the heart. To the ancients, thymos was an essential part of being human. Thymos does not care for the strictly rational or bodily fancies. Plato, in his Phaedrus, provided a now famous chariot analogy. Logos can be understood as a man on a chariot. A well-bred and noble white horse represents Thymos, and a less refined black horse embodies primal desire. The charioteer, only with great effort, acts to dictate the horses towards his own goal and stop them from leading him wherever they please. Some philosophers propose that our present social structure fails to address this essential part of the human psyche adequately. Many of us, I think, would agree when we feel lacking in community and unrepresented or misunderstood by those in power. People have a thymotic yearning for the society they live in to prioritize their dignity and assess their worth using criteria different from those prevalent in the established order. This dissatisfaction takes many forms and is presented in countless different ways, whether it be Nietzsche's Der Antichrist or David Fincher's Fight Club. Suicide is at an all-time high. Young people have more mental health issues than ever and are increasingly unsocialized. The fertility rate is at an all-time low. Identity crises are rampant, and social cohesion is almost non-existent in many places. Most of us have almost nothing in common with our neighbors. People are searching for their place in the world. It's obvious that we need more than what we have been provided with to be happy. Many of these problems come from society's neglect to cultivate a healthy relationship with our thymotic needs. In this way, we live in a dysthymic world. In the current Western socio-political consensus, there is rarely a prioritization of anything other than wealth. Globalization and industrialization are a turn towards material desire, while our deeper, more enigmatic needs are neglected. Our current policies focus on maximizing economic efficiency and productivity, often at the expense of community bonds and mankind's sense of dignity, honor, and belonging. People are not respected as men but as consumers and as interchangeable and replaceable numbers. The uncouth horse is steering the charioteer on a frenzied journey, while the noble horse struggles along bewildered and disoriented. Society has been working against Thymos instead of alongside it, failing to nurture a constructive relationship with our thymotic needs. The philosopher Francis Fukuyama is amongst the most high-profile thinkers who are incorporating the concept of Thymos into contemporary socio-political commentary. Fukuyama's reasoning, I think, holds value for those contemplating collective identity, even if their perspectives diverge in certain aspects. I think integrating the language and terminology used by Fukuyama enables sensible supporters of community creation and preservation, and of nation building and nation reconstructing, to gain legitimacy in the mainstream discourse. Fukuyama is famously one of liberalism's most legendary defenders, but he is also acutely aware of the problems that liberalism has given us, and agrees that it has led to the fragmentation of society. When talking about contemporary economics, he states, "Modern economic theory is built around the assumption that human beings are rational individuals who all want to maximize their utility, that is, their material well-being, and that politics is simply an extension of that maximizing behavior. However, if we are ever to properly interpret the behavioral of real human beings in the contemporary world, we have to expand our understanding of human motivation beyond this simple economic model that so dominates much of our discourse. No one contests that human beings are capable of rational behavior, or that they are self-interested individuals who seek greater wealth and resources. But human psychology is much more complex than the rather simple-minded economic model suggests." He is in agreement that human psychology requires more than just material well-being. To continue living, we need belonging. Fukuyama believes that identity politics is one way that Thymos is channeled today. Identity politics functions as a type of interest group pluralism, where different identity groups, often united on immutable traits, compete for greater recognition, or a larger portion of the collective whole. Diminished social cohesion fosters the proliferation of identity groups and intensifies their competitiveness. A low-trust society follows. Fukuyama sees identity-based advocacy as a demand for dignity of their particular identity group, and therefore an exercise of the Thymos. The question is not whether identity politics is ideal, or if it is good or bad. It is clear that identity politics can often lead to intergenerational cycles of resentment and violence. Many parts of the world have undergone centuries, if not millennia, of interethnic conflict. Identity politics has spawned entire genocides. On the other hand, it also led to legislations of civil rights, cases of actual social justice, and the sovereignty of entire nations. Embracing Thymos and identity politics yields varied outcomes, some of which have undeniably brought about positive change in the world, and some of which brought about extremely negative change. Regardless, if thymotic impulses are truly an integral part of the human psyche, there is no getting rid of it. The question we should be asking is, how do we deal with these thymotic impulses in the socio-political sphere? Should we embrace them, tamper them, have a laissez-faire approach? How can we know if instances of identity-based advocacy are going to bring about desired outcomes, or whether they will lead to a new form of tyranny? To understand this question a little more thoroughly, I'd like to return to Fukuyama's thoughts on Thymos and collective identity, especially his history of dignity, which is presented in his 2018 book, Identity. Different cultures identify different segments of society as being capable of a dignified life. In ancient Greece, for example, it was more common for dignity to belong exclusively to those at the top of the then rigid social hierarchy. Soldiers demanded dignity, and they sought it by exhibiting courage and the willingness to risk death in public service to the polis. The Jewish and Christian concept of dignity is centered around the capacity for moral choice. Recall the story of Adam and Eve. They existed in a state of innocence until Eve chose to take the forbidden fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Christianity introduced a kind of human fungibility. According to Fukuyama, in the Christian tradition, all human beings are fundamentally equal. They are endowed with an equal capacity for choice. Slowly, this Christian concept of egalitarianism was actualized. Dignity over thousands of years was given to the people. The French Revolution and its plentiful echoes were driven by peoples demanding recognition of their political personhood. that they were moral agents capable of sharing in political power. Hegel viewed the entire history of the world as a long list of slave revolts. The Hegelian view of progress was the everlasting struggle for the recognition of moral agency and of dignity. Kant also helps secularize this Christian morality that is centered on shared human dignity. Christianity, Kant, and Hegel created a right to dignity. In addition to this, Fukuyama explains how a few other thinkers drastically changed the way we think about identity and dignity. Martin Luther is largely responsible for the modern distinction between the inner and outer self. Luther thought that mankind had an inner spiritual self, as well as a bodily and external social being. Luther was the first to write of an inner self that is deep and possesses many layers that can be exposed only through private introspection. To Luther, it was this deeply personal inner self that truly mattered. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, on the other hand, is responsible for the importance of lived experience that characterizes 21st century identity politics. Rousseau did not believe that family, community, or thymos was actually essential to mankind. To him, early humans were individualistic and free. Resentment, jealousy, competition, and pride only came into existence recently, once society was sufficiently developed. To Rousseau, the importance of the inner self is to experience the sentiment de l'existence, the self removed from all social influence. In Rousseau's view, the true self, your true identity, is the primal self, removed from all socialization and community. According to Fukuyama, the right to dignity, mentioned earlier, helped form both nationalism and democratic liberalism. These movements developed side by side. The expansion of dignity in the early 19th century increased both individualism and collective national identity. The revolutions of 1848 are the perfect example of this. A form of universal individual identity and a particular national identity grew alongside each other. An increase in opportunity, choice, freedom, and weakening of religious faith led to alienation and fragmentation. If shared values are what makes social life possible, then an increase in expressive individualism will begin to break down social cohesion. Fukuyama thinks that the crisis of identity helped create modern nationalism. 19th century nationalism presented itself when there was a psychological need. Industrialization, urbanization, and liberalization led to the loss of community and security. Fukuyama asked us to think of a contemporary immigrant in a Western country. The immigrant may have made the decision to leave their family and traditional way of life behind for the sake of economic benefit, but their children and their children's children did not. Typically, it is second, third, and even fourth generation immigrants who face an identity crisis and struggle with it in various ways. Sometimes they embrace their rootlessness, but often they feel robbed and turn to an appreciation of the traditions that they missed out on and identify strongly with their ancestral homeland. A very similar thing happened throughout Europe with the rapid urbanization of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. The result was 19th century style romantic nationalism. We may be seeing the continuation of this trend with 21st century identitarianism. Today, when people turn to religion, to heritage, and to identity, it's because they feel disconnected to these things in the first place. These emerging affiliations manifest in diverse and numerous forms. Society does not provide an outlet for the thymos, so people carve space for it in extremely different ways. Some are more harmful than others. One example is contemporary identity politics, rooted in popular critical theory, which Fukuyama critiques extensively. He finds 21st century identity politics to be extremely divisive and polarizing due to its tendency to pit identity groups against each other. By focusing only on the psychological needs of narrow identity groups, we undermine social cohesion. Fukuyama advocates steering away from social fragmentation and instead seeks to nurture a broader national identity. We need to avoid making the same mistakes while also ensuring that the thymos finds expression in the sociopolitical sphere. There are many undesirable ways people approach thymotic release via turning to identity. Sometimes people are misguided and LARP themselves into a representative of some mythologized culture. Some dogmatically adopt a prepackaged personality. Some have an unhealthy overattachment to identity. Some are more of a political aesthetic craving for belonging than a person. These absurd extremities may show themselves more in societies where the thymos is suppressed. An embrace of the thymos does not necessarily entail a move towards collectivism or the erosion of individualism and personal expression. For many, embracing identity simply represents a revival of pride in one's country or community, and fosters a feeling of belonging. It can be a reintegration of the self into something larger. When people turn to identity, it often reflects a concern for the future and an investment in long-term outcomes, rather than solely focusing on living in the present moment. Understanding your identity and your part in a larger community or particular culture does not have to come from critical theory or some sort of esoteric traditionalism. It does not have to be complex, elusive, or theoretical. It merely needs to be a means of emancipating the thymos from the neglect that it faces in contemporary society. One way to do this is, as I have said, turning to identity, which in its best case would be simply understanding that you are not a universal man. You embody a particular culture, moral system, and aesthetic taste that is not shared universally. Mainstream 21st century identity politics is one way we can unleash the thymotic part of our psyche, but Fukuyama concludes that it can be off-putting to many individuals when it prioritizes the dignity of one group at the expense of another. Fukuyama introduced the concept of megalothymia to describe an excessive craving for recognition that diminishes those outside one's own identity group. Megalothymia is a desire to be recognized that is so intense and so self-centered that it completely devalues the worth of identity groups outside their own. It is an assertion of one's own identity and importance in a way that creates tyranny and domination of one group over another. Nazi Germany is the perfect example of an overreach of the thymos, but I am sure we are able to think of less severe examples in our modern day. Megalothymia may come from arrogance, but it also may come from a given group's resentment and trauma. Megalothymia often involves the desire to universalize a particular. In a way, this is the definition of empire. Megalothymia does not provide a genuine solution to the 21st century identity crisis. In addition to the obvious moral concerns that megalothymia brings, on a more practical level too, it fails to truly resolve the psychological need for recognition and instead perpetuates cycles of resentment. Any fleeting recognition and symbolic triumph that a group achieves through a megalothymic outburst ultimately breeds resentment in other groups. Under the dominance of megalothymic tyranny, non-ruling identity groups will become increasingly aware of the disparities imposed upon them, intensifying their own psychological desire for retaliation. Once a period of megalothymic imposition ends, the marginalized, non-ruling group may harbor justified resentment and trauma for generations. Overall, it is evident that megalothymia exacerbates rather than resolves issues. Democratic liberalism has indeed divided us into global and materialistic last men. Even liberalism's greatest defender, Fukuyama, agrees. There's no need to shy away from acknowledging this reality. At the same time, we must avoid overreacting in our efforts to address these challenges. In our intricately connected world, we are completely unable to avoid interacting with identity groups different from our own. If we are to turn towards community, heritage, nationalism, or religion, we must do so in a way that does not overextend. To achieve genuine solutions, we must approach these issues strategically, with warmth and thoughtfulness, rather than impulsiveness and hostility. There can, in fact, be advocacy for the dignity of one's own identity group without dominating other groups. Fukuyama, along with megalothymia, coined the term isothymia, Isothymia is the aspiration to be valued and acknowledged as an individual among many. This can be applied to group identities as well. Nationalism can be isothymic or megalothymic. Think of the independence of the United States, or the breakup of the Austrian Empire into nation-states, versus the expansive ambitions of Imperial Japan or Napoleon's conquest of Europe. Isothymia seeks liberation, not conquest. If megalothymia is universalism, then isothymia is particularism. Isothymia is the psychological foundation that dismantles empires, eliminates subjugation, and gives sovereignty to communities. We cannot avoid identity politics. Instead, we must redirect them towards healthier expressions. We must satisfy the human need for recognition that has been so thoroughly disregarded. Fukuyama agrees that we must reintegrate into democratic liberalism the elements that have been deprived of us or neglected. Dysthymia is what creates the last man. It is necessary to recognize Thymos as a legitimate part of the human psyche, and therefore a legitimate part of the socio-political world. Whether you perceive this as a continuation of liberalism, or of a new form of post-liberalism, is up to you. We can turn to Thymos without falling into autocratic radicalism, or fantasizing about domination. You can also recognize the Thymos without being enthralled by it. It does not need to be, and indeed should not be, your sole or predominant way of viewing the world. Identity politics cannot continue to exist as it does now. Society is too fragmented to continue. Contemporary identity politics arose from this fragmentation, but it also exacerbates it by prompting many to feel that their own group's identity is being infringed upon by the thymotic outlashes of other identity groups. In short, contemporary identity politics is far too comfortable with normalizing megalothymia. The dignity of one group should not diminish the dignity of another. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this. There's obviously a lot you are able to disagree with here. Let me know what you think. The reason I made this video is because I thought it might be important to make the terms of thymos, thymia, isothymia, megalothymia more popular. I think these terms are very relevant to a lot of modern issues, and I feel like people should be able to articulate exactly what's going on when one identity group or even individual overreaches. And this stuff happens obviously on all sides of the political spectrum. So I'm sure you're intelligent enough to identify different groups on the left and the right that do this. And I'm also sure you know individuals in your life that maybe have this megalothymia. It just kind of makes them unbearable. But you also know people who are dysthymic and don't stand up for themselves. So maybe if we can push for a world where we have a healthy sense of isothymia, both in individuals and in communities, I think that might be beneficial. Again, let me know what you think. Thank you for listening, and please consider subscribing and following me on social media. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and I also publish some smaller articles on Substack and Medium. Thank you.